Joanna Claire Yeates was a landscape designer from Hampshire, England, who went missing on December 17th, 2010, in the city of Bristol. Following extensive searches and police investigations, her body was discovered on December 25th, 2010, in Fayland, North Somerset. An autopsy revealed that she had been strangled. Known affectionately as Jo by her loved ones, she was one of two children in her family, with an older brother named Chris. Joanna had a happy childhood and was raised in a loving environment created by her parents. They were relatively affluent and sent her to a private school. After receiving her diploma, she enrolled at the University of Essex, where she studied landscape design and graduated with a degree in the field. This higher education allowed her to become a skilled professional and achieve her dream, as she had always wanted to work on landscaping and beautifying outdoor spaces. Her education and recommendations enabled her to secure a position at a promising company in Bristol, where she was offered a role as a landscape designer. By the end of 2010, Joanna Yeates was a 25-year-old ambitious young woman who excelled at her job and had already built a solid reputation. During this period, she was in a relationship with a 27-year-old man named Greg Reardon. The couple met in December 2008 and had been together for 2 years. They quickly began dating and later decided to move in together in Clifton, Bristol, when Joanna was offered her job in October 2010. This was a significant milestone in Joanna's life, as everything seemed to be falling perfectly into place for her to build her future. Greg and Joanna were hardworking and successful young people who wanted to establish themselves financially and professionally before thinking about marriage and children. Starting in October 2010, they began renting an apartment on the ground floor of a private house in the city. They quickly immersed themselves in work to secure their positions. Joanna was described as very positive, cheerful, and full of energy. Christmas was approaching, and the couple was excited to celebrate it for the first time in their new apartment. They decorated their home, prepared gifts for their loved ones, and eagerly anticipated the holiday. No one could have imagined that this year's celebration would be overshadowed by such a horrific event. On the evening of Friday, December 17th, 2010, 25-year-old Joanna planned to join her colleagues at a nearby bar after work for a couple of cocktails before the weekend. Everything was routine. The group drank, laughed, and enjoyed each other's company. Around 8 p.m., Joanna left the pub to head home. She walked through the city center, stopped by a supermarket, but found nothing to her liking at the first store, Waitrose. She then headed to another store, where she purchased 2 bottles of cider, and later went to Tesco, where she bought a pizza. After gathering everything she needed, Joanna arrived at her apartment at 8:50 p.m. She turned on the oven to heat the pizza and exchanged messages with several colleagues about evening plans. According to her colleagues, Joanna intended to spend the rest of the evening alone, as Greg was out of town for the weekend visiting relatives in another city. She had confided in her colleagues that the prospect of spending the weekend by herself made her feel a bit down, so she planned to keep herself busy with Christmas preparations to distract herself. She also intended to bake pies to share with her coworkers after the weekend. Greg returned home on the afternoon of Sunday, December 19th, expecting to see Joanna, but she was not there. He found her purse, keys, and other belongings that she would never leave behind. Her winter coat, which she regularly wore during the season, was also still there. Greg immediately called her, but all this did was lead him to her phone, which was in the living room. What alarmed him the most was that she had left without her mobile phone. By all accounts, Joanna should have been home, not at work. Even if she had gone to the store or visited someone, why would she leave without her coat, phone, and keys? None of it made sense. Greg also noticed that their cat hadn't been fed in some time. The cat was clearly very hungry and pounced on the food he gave it. He was horrified as he realized that something must have happened to Joanna during the 2 days he had been away in another city. Greg had repeatedly tried calling and texting her while he was gone, but she hadn't responded. At first, he thought it was due to network issues, but now he began to suspect that something bad had happened on the very day he left. Greg knew that 2 days ago, Joanna had planned to go to a pub with her colleagues. Since then, He had received no information from her. Desperate, Greg contacted Joanna's parents, friends, and coworkers, but none of them knew where she was. By nightfall, when Greg's patience was exhausted, he went to the police station and reported his girlfriend missing. Given the time that had passed, the police immediately launched an investigation. The possibility of abduction was taken very seriously. The first step in the investigation was to search the couple's apartment. No signs of violence or forced entry were found. It appeared that Joanna knew her abductor and had willingly opened the door. She was likely attacked inside the apartment. Investigators found a receipt showing that Joanna had purchased pizza and 2 bottles of cider on the evening of December 17. One of the bottles had been opened, and it looked like she had taken a couple of sips before something happened that caused her to abandon everything. However, neither the pizza box nor the food itself was found in the kitchen or trash. If Joanna had been attacked immediately with the intent to abduct or harm her, it seemed unlikely she would have had time to eat the pizza and dispose of the box. Evidence suggested she disappeared on the evening of December 17th, as confirmed by her advent calendar, which she hadn't opened on the 17th or 18th, even though she had been consistently doing so every evening before that. All of this painted a very concerning picture. On December 21st, Greg and Joanna's family appeared on television, pleading for any information from potential witnesses. After this, news of her disappearance spread rapidly across the country. Naturally, during this time, the authorities were investigating those closest to Joanna. Greg was one of the first to be scrutinized. His trip out of town could have conveniently served as an alibi. However, he quickly proved that he had indeed been with relatives in another city, and he was ruled out as a suspect. Additionally, there was no indication of any issues in their relationship that might have led to violence. By all accounts, their relationship was happy and stable. Police also interviewed neighbors. Joanna and Greg lived in a house divided into 3 sections. The ground floor had 2 rental apartments, while the landlord occupied the upper floor. The landlord was questioned but claimed he hadn't heard or seen anything unusual that evening. The neighbors on the ground floor were a couple, Vincent, an engineer, and Tanya, an analyst. They were respectable people with stable careers, never involved in trouble, and were planning to get married soon. The young couple stated that they didn't know their neighbors at all, as they had recently moved in and hadn't had a chance to meet them. On that fateful evening, Tanya was at a corporate party, while Vincent was at home and picked her up at 2 a.m. He didn't hear anything suspicious. The couple lived in the house across from Joanna's apartment. On that evening, December 17th, they were hosting a party that was quite loud, with music playing and people talking noisily. During the night, they heard loud screams from a woman, but everyone at the party was drunk. Nobody paid much attention since the sounds quickly stopped and it wasn't clear where they were coming from. Now, they believed it might have been connected to their missing neighbor. Initially, everyone hoped Joanna would return home safe and sound, but as days passed, confidence dwindled. On December 25th, 2010, 5 kilometers from Joanna's apartment, a young couple was walking their dogs along the roadside. This area was considered rather deserted, located on the outskirts of the city. The couple noticed something suspicious sticking out from under the snow by the side of the road. It looked like a piece of clothing, so they decided to investigate. After digging a little, they discovered a woman's body. The couple immediately contacted the police. The deceased was quickly identified as 25-year-old Joanna Yeates, who had been missing. It was determined that her body had been lying by the roadside since December 17th, the entire time she had been searched for. That weekend, a heavy snowfall covered the body, preventing its discovery for an entire week. When forensic experts examined the site where the body was found, they immediately noticed that it was not only covered in snow, but also deliberately concealed with leaves and branches. It did not resemble the scene of a random hit-and-run accident. It was believed that Joanna had been intentionally hidden there. She was found wearing the same clothes as on Friday evening, except for her coat, which remained in her apartment. Her shirt was pushed up, partially exposing her right breast, suggesting a possible motive related to the attack. Joanna had worn warm socks, but one of them was missing, and it could not be located even after a thorough search of the surrounding area. Police theorized that this missing sock might be a clue to the murderer. Serial killers and criminals sometimes take such items as trophies. The autopsy concluded that the cause of death was strangulation. In addition to marks on her neck, there were 43 other injuries on her body, including abrasions, deep scratches, and bruises from blunt force trauma. The injuries indicated that Joanna had put up a desperate fight for her life. The cold weather preserved the body exceptionally well, almost entirely preventing decomposition. Joanna was found in a fetal position, which appeared to have been deliberate. The examination revealed that there was no pizza in her stomach, meaning she hadn't had a chance to eat before the attack. Interestingly, just a meter from the body was a concrete barrier. Blood found on the barrier was confirmed to belong to Joanna. It seemed that the killer initially intended to move the body over the barrier, but for some reason failed to do so. This suggested that Joanna was murdered in one location and her body was hidden in another. The scene implied that the perpetrator or perpetrators had been interrupted. Perhaps they were startled and forced to flee, leaving the body partially concealed. During the examination of the victim's clothing, DNA was found on Joanna's jeans that belonged to a man, presumably the killer. The traces were located near the zipper area, suggesting a sexually motivated attack. Once it became clear that this was a brutal murder, a large-scale operation to find the perpetrator was launched. It would become one of the largest investigations ever conducted by police in this region of the United Kingdom. Around 80 detectives were assigned to the case and continued to appeal to the public for information. A reward of £10,000 was initially offered for any tips leading to the arrest of the criminal, later increased to £60,000. Joanna's friends created a website and used social media to assist in the investigation. Detectives, meanwhile, began analyzing the victim's immediate social circle. They found that Joanna had no enemies or ill-wishers. She was non-confrontational, not prone to aggression, and had no ongoing disputes with anyone. Investigators collected CCTV footage from the Clifton Suspension Bridge, which was on Joanna's route home from the pub that evening, the last place she was seen alive. They meticulously reviewed the recordings. However, the footage was of poor quality, and nothing suspicious could be discerned. Investigators theorized that the killer might have used an alternative bridge over the River Avon, located about a kilometer from Joanna's home, to avoid CCTV cameras, but this too remained speculative. Authorities believed they had a potential suspect, Christopher Jeffries, the landlord of the apartment Joanna rented. Christopher was a retired school teacher who now earned his income through property rentals. He was described as a quiet, highly intelligent, yet rather eccentric individual. Before these events, no one had ever considered him capable of involvement in anything criminal. His peculiar behavior had never been seen as threatening. However, police visited Christopher again to question him about the evening of December 17th. According to the landlord, he had gone to the gym to work out that evening and returned to his apartment around 9 p.m., not leaving again afterward. This time frame coincided with when Joanna had likely returned home. Christopher stated that he hadn't seen or heard anything unusual that evening or during the night, no women's screams as reported by the partygoers across the street. However, his alibi was weak as he lived alone and had no one to corroborate his account. What raised further suspicion was a change in his story during a subsequent interview with detectives. This time, Christopher mentioned that just before returning home, he had seen a group of unfamiliar young men nearby who struck him as suspicious. He claimed he couldn't make out their faces clearly. This addition to his account was viewed with skepticism, and Christopher became the primary suspect. Doubt intensified when Joanna's boyfriend, Greg, informed the police that Mr. Jeffries helped him jumpstart his car on the morning of December 17, just before Greg left town. They had a conversation. The Greek clearly remembered telling her that he was leaving for the entire weekend and was worried that his girlfriend would be left alone. Naturally, the perpetrator could have seen this as an opportunity for an attack. The police's suspicions were still not supported by anything, but somehow the journalists found out that Joanna's landlord was the main suspect. Reporters started chasing him on the street, and the situation reached a point where Christopher was forced to stay home most of the time because journalists were waiting for him outside. The situation only worsened when various rumors about the suspect started being printed in all the newspapers. He complained that he was on the verge of a nervous breakdown and didn't feel safe going outside. Christopher was openly called a criminal, with stories fabricated about child abuse during his time as a teacher. On December 30th, 2010, the police arrested Christopher Jeffries. He was literally tortured with interrogations. However, the man was adamant, insisting that he was not involved in the murder. At that point, the authorities had nothing against the landlord that could be presented in court. But later, a man named Vincent, the second tenant living in Mr. Jeffries' house, came to the station. He suddenly remembered that on that evening, he had left the house twice and had seen the landlord's car parked on the driveway both times. The first time he saw it was early in the evening, and then again when he went out at night to look for Tanya. Vincent noticed that the car was parked in the same spot, but had been turned in the opposite direction. This indicated that the owner had clearly gone somewhere at night, which contradicted his statements that he hadn't gone out. During searches of Christopher's apartment, a pair of sneakers were found with suspicious stains that resembled small blood spots. All of this was sent to the laboratory for analysis, but testing would take time. According to UK law, the police cannot hold a suspect for more than 24 hours unless they have sufficient evidence to justify an arrest. After a day, the suspect is either released or the police must go to court to extend the detention period. This time, they chose to extend the detention of Christopher. More time was needed to analyze the collected evidence and to officially register the statement from witness Vincent. The arrest was extended, but contrary to expectations, the police could not prove the man's involvement in the crime. The stains found on the sneakers were too small to extract a DNA profile according to the technologies available at the time. After laboratory testing, the pair of sneakers were returned with the conclusion that no DNA samples could be obtained, and it was impossible to determine whose stains they were. However, it was not even this that led to the decision to release Mr. Jeffries. The male DNA found on the victim's body and clothing did not match his profile. On January 1st, 2011, on a holiday, Christopher Jeffries was released without charges. It was good news for him, but the journalists still wouldn't leave him alone. The investigation still had a very valuable lead. The second tenant of Mr. Jeffries, Vincent Tabak, who had told the story about the landlord's car being moved, seemed suspicious, had no alibi at the time of the crime, and automatically became the new suspect. The police believed that Vincent was trying to blame the landlord in an attempt to deceive the investigation, while, in reality, he was the perpetrator. Suspicions against Vincent began to strengthen immediately when he called the police station and told the story of how Christopher's car had been moved. At the time of the call, he was in the Netherlands. It was unclear why Vincent hadn't mentioned this earlier. To get an official statement from him, a few officers went to visit him on December 31st, 2010. They reported that during the questioning, the young man behaved strangely. Vincent was vague in some of his responses, while at other times he gave very precise, almost rehearsed answers. Such fluctuations were suspicious to experienced police officers. It seemed as though he was carefully thinking through his responses and controlling the information the police received. The most suspicious detail was that there were scratches on his hands, which he couldn't explain. He claimed that he didn't even know Joanna, since he had only moved into the apartment 2 weeks before the incident. When the new suspect was asked for fingerprints and DNA samples for analysis, he was clearly reluctant to provide them. He explained that he had visited the neighboring apartment with the landlord when Joanna wasn't there and might have accidentally left his DNA behind. Vincent hesitated for a long time before agreeing to give samples for comparison. It seemed suspicious, and indeed, his profile showed a partial match with evidence found on the victim's body, but there was one major problem. The issue was that a quality DNA sample from the killer's body could not be obtained, as Joanna had been lying on the side of the road under snow for a week, exposed to the elements. Because of this, the samples had been significantly damaged and contaminated. Therefore, even a partial match with Vincent did not guarantee that he was the killer. However, it did become a strong argument in the list of police suspicions. Now the authorities decided to analyze the young man's background in more detail. Vincent Tabak was born on February 10th, 1978. At the time of Joanna Yeates' murder, he was 32 years old. He was originally from the Netherlands and was the youngest of 5 children in his family. From a young age, he was a quiet and shy boy, more introverted than some of his peers. However, Vincent was always a very intelligent child, striving for great achievements. In 2003, he earned a master's degree after graduating from a technical university in the Netherlands. Interestingly, like Joanna, he received a degree in landscape design and also wanted to develop himself in this field. In 2007, Vincent moved to the United Kingdom, where he found work as an engineer. That same year, he met a woman named Tanya. The couple then moved to Bristol, where they rented an apartment in Christopher Jeffrey's house. From the start, the landlord viewed the young couple very positively because Vincent was quiet, calm, and friendly. He had no criminal record, which reassured the former teacher and led him to offer them housing. Previously, the tenant had no legal issues, and no one had noted any signs of aggression. On January 20th, 2011, 32-year-old Vincent Tabak was arrested on suspicion of murdering Joanna Yeates. From the beginning, he denied his guilt and stuck to his original story. The more meetings he had with detectives, the more his statements changed, adding new details. He had previously claimed that he hadn't left the house in the evening until he went to pick up his girlfriend Tanya at 2 a.m. Now, however, he said that on that fateful evening, he had left the house twice, once to take photos and then to go to the supermarket. Vincent remained adamant only about not having killed Joanna. It became clear that he was lying, trying to evade responsibility by any means. The police discovered which car the suspect had been driving and then thoroughly reviewed footage from street surveillance cameras along the most likely routes the killer might have taken when disposing of the victim's body. Detectives weren't shocked when they saw the car belonging to the main suspect along much of the route. The vehicle was seized and sent for forensic examination. In the trunk, a large amount of pink fibers were discovered, identical to the fibers from a top worn by the victim, which had been used in the crime. Additionally, they were mixed with fibers from the suspect's clothing. But the most significant piece of evidence found by forensic experts was the blood stains in the trunk. When the blood was tested, it was confirmed to belong to the victim. It was clear that the perpetrator had tried to clean the car to remove any evidence. It even had the smell of cleaning products, but he hadn't done it thoroughly enough. The detectives then confiscated the suspect's laptop and mobile phone. Analyzing the devices revealed that the attack had been sexually motivated from the start. The laptop contained numerous images and videos, and the browser history showed searches related to violent and extreme sexual content. The suspect's preferred actions appeared to be strangulation and assault, which were consistent with the way the victim was killed. It was revealed that the suspect frequently visited escort websites and met with individuals in real life. He had been living a double life. To the outside world, he seemed like a respectable person engaged to Tanya, but in reality, he harbored dark secrets. Furthermore, many search queries were found that had been made after the crime, specifically seeking information about his neighbor. The perpetrator had been closely following the progress of the investigation. The detectives noticed one particularly unsettling detail. After checking on the investigation into the victim's death, the suspect would view violent content online. It was believed that he was re-experiencing the crime in his mind, deriving satisfaction from it. This pattern of behavior suggested that the suspect could potentially be a serial offender, likely to commit another crime once the associations with the previous victim stopped providing him with the same gratification. Among the incriminating searches were attempts to find out everything related to murders and the decomposition of the human body. After this disturbing information was uncovered on January 24th, 2011, Vincent Tabak was charged with first-degree murder. Although he had previously denied any involvement, he now confessed. However, the suspect claimed that he never intended to kill his victim. He denied that the attack was premeditated, insisting that everything had happened by accident. Therefore, he argued it was not a deliberate murder. In October 2011, hearings began, but the judge did not allow the prosecution to use the suspect's interest in violent and sexual content as evidence of guilt. During the trial, Vincent defended himself and presented his final version of events. According to the defendant, on the evening of December 17th, 2010, he was alone in his apartment as his girlfriend had gone to a Christmas party with colleagues. When Vincent returned from the store, he saw Joanna through the window. She waved at him and invited him to come in. She offered him some cider as soon as he entered, and then made some flirtatious remark that Vincent misunderstood, thinking it was an invitation to have intimate relations. He immediately acted, took a step forward, and kissed his neighbor, but she immediately screamed and pushed him away. Vincent panicked, afraid, covered her mouth, and grabbed her neck with his hands, trying to silence her. According to him, he held his hand on her neck for about 20 seconds before realizing that Joanna showed no signs of life. In this way, he denied any sexual motive, attributing the situation to a misunderstanding and an unfortunate accident, though he was unable to explain why he didn't simply leave without attacking, or at least call for help. During the trial, the defendant's behavior raised questions. Vincent Tabak changed his version of events several times, which cast doubt on his credibility. The prosecution argued that his story did not explain the numerous injuries sustained by the victim. Joanna had a broken nose, which could indicate that she struggled to defend herself. The prosecution believed Vincent had been observing his neighbor for some time and entered her apartment that evening when he knew she would be alone. He might have learned that she would be alone by accidentally overhearing a conversation between her acquaintances. According to the prosecution, Vincent might have had feelings for her, which he later lied about. From the start, his actions seemed to be aimed at causing her harm. Vincent was physically strong and easily handled the situation. He was significantly taller than Joanna, which gave him an advantage in the struggle. During the confrontation, she sustained several injuries. The struggle was prolonged, and the consequences were slow and painful. After the incident, Vincent took the victim's belongings, which explained the absence of the packaging, even though it appeared on a receipt found in the apartment. He likely disposed of the packaging, fearing it might contain evidence. At 9:25 p.m., Vincent texted his girlfriend, saying he was bored and alone at home, possibly trying to create an alibi. Afterward, he loaded the victim's belongings into the trunk of his car and drove to another area. The prosecution emphasized that before the jury stood a dangerous individual whose actions raised doubts about his trustworthiness and demonstrated that he was capable of further harmful behavior. On October 26, 2011, when the final arguments were made, the jury went to deliberate the verdict. This stage took a whole 2 days. Finally, on October 28, they returned with the decision that Vincent Tabak was guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole in 20 years. But his criminal history didn't end there. In March 2015, he was charged with possession of child pornography. The fact was that 145 explicit photos were discovered on his laptop. Vincent again pleaded guilty and received an additional 10 months to his sentence. After Vincent was convicted, Christopher Jeffries sought retribution for the moral damage he had suffered. He filed claims against several newspapers, accusing them of defamation. These were the publications that printed the most provocative stories about him. In fact, he managed to win 8 lawsuits. The former teacher received apologies, and as a result of the trials, the publications were required to pay significant financial compensation for the moral and reputational damage. But Christopher Jeffries went even further. In 2014, a 2-part drama titled The Lost Honor was released, telling the story of the former teacher who was wronged due to the murder of a woman to whom he had rented an apartment. If you enjoyed my work, subscribe to the channel. Support this video with a like, and let's discuss this story in the comments. Thank you and goodbye.